Thank you very much, Mr. Prebes. Thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to give the welcoming lecture here. And yeah, hello to everyone. I'm happy to see you in this room filled. So for those of you standing up there, there's a lot of free seats up down here. So if you like to sit, I think there is still time to find a seat. The Governance of Sustainability, Reflections on Science and Policy is this very broad title of my speak today, because I thought it's really good to give an overarching idea on what we talk about when we have, now it's not working here, let me see. No, okay. When we talk about the need to transform our societal relationships to nature, because this is in the end what we are talking about. We need to stop the way we are engaging with nature, the way we are transforming nature, the way we are consuming resources and material, and this will change everything. All our lifestyles and consumption modes, our ways of living, inhabiting, our ways to be mobile, our ways to consume goods and services. But still, I think there's a huge misunderstanding of the fundamentality of the change, because I think we still believe that there are easy solutions and technological fixes. And when the vice president said, I think he left already, but when he said, okay, it's nice to have this young generation sitting in this room, because you are the one who are responsible for the future and who will like shape the future, I would argue, no, the future is now. We are actually currently shaping the future with all our decisions, with all our spatial decisions we are building and cementing today. And this is what the talk is about. So I will look in the unsustainable present. That will be my first argument. The second will be that I will briefly reflect on the governance of sustainability, because we have a 50-year-old tradition in governing sustainability, but yet we are in the unsustainable present, what the first point was. Then I would then reflect on the nexus of knowing and governing, and argue that we really need to engage with knowledge politics, because there is a definite coupling, and this coupling stabilizes the current status quo, and thereby leading us to unsustainable futures. And then I would end with a very brief summary reflecting on what do we need if we talk about a governance for sustainability and not anymore the governance of sustainability. So these are the four main points I'm going today in the next 30 minutes or 45 minutes. Turning a crisis into an opportunity, Simin Davoudi says, requires a great deal of preparedness, which in turn depends on the capacity to imagine alternative futures. And this is an invitation for you to keep this quote, it's a very smart quote, I think, in mind, and keep yourself asking, are we really already imagining these alternative futures, or are we still within our frame of reference? Because it's, as I said, fundamental what we need to think about. The unsustainable present is currently shaped by unsustainable socio-economic trends that can be, for example, this is just a rough selection of important driving factors looked into these one, for example, into housing. And if we look at the housing sector in Germany, but also worldwide in the global sense, we see that the tendency and the cultural norm to live in the single family home is still the mainstream, and it's even increasing the wish for single family homes that then again drive, for example, mobility needs and also other resources. For example, the cement the houses are built of and the roads the houses are built of. And if we look at the trends more specifically, we see that in 1960, I guess, it's so small in my presentation here that I can't really see it now, we lived at 19 square meter per person, and now we are living at 47 square meter per person. So it's increasing tremendously, and it's still increasing, despite the fact that we've been talking about the sustainability shift for a while now. If we look into the mobility sector, it looks more of the same. This is a graph that shows how many personal cars there are in Germany, data from the Environmental Protection Agency. You see a sharp increase in the cars. That's the green column that you see. And between 2007 and 2008, there is this abrupt shift. That's just a statistical issue within these data, but the tendency and the trend is still increasing, although we are talking about the need to shift our mobility practices. And if we zoom in these data, we see that there is even a trend, and I guess we all know this because we are reading it all day long in the newspapers, a shift toward larger cars, SUVs. And the huge car manufacturers, the huge car industries, they just announced that they will even decrease the small car sector and the medium car sector. So we are talking about pop-up bike lanes in cities. We are talking about more public transport, but the trend goes towards more cars. And we all know how difficult it is, of course, to shift to more sustainable modes of mobility, but still we need to acknowledge the unsustainable trends. If we look into the supply sector, we can just look at the indicators of the material consumption. That's the global material footprint that I have here for you. You see a sharp increase in the global material footprint that is needed to sustain our consumption modes. And we also see that there is a strong correlation to the GDP. And I will come back to this correlation later, because economic growth and the largely unquestioned paradigm of economic growth is fueling this material footprint that we are observing. The work and labor section is just another dimension we can look at. Here I have inequality data gained from the ZEP data, like the socioeconomisches panel, this longitudinal data that we have to measure certain socioeconomic trends. And as already Thomas Piketty analyzed, the inequality in terms of income, for example, here now we look at income, is increasing. So that tells us also something about the social dimension, which is really important if we talk about sustainability, because that is ultimately also about the social dimension. And just another indicator, if we zoom into that dimension, is the amount of care work that is largely done by women still, although we are talking about gender equality as well. And gender equality is just another target and objective of the sustainability goals, for example. So care work, and we've seen that in the last and the still sort of ongoing corona crisis, is something that we have to deal with if we really want to talk and engage with sustainability in all the dimensions. And last but not least, just another dimension that I have for you, that is the international tourist arrivals by region. Here we also see a huge increase in touristic activities that drive, again, material consumption, that emit CO2 emissions, for example. But of course, it's also a huge economic sector Tourism is one of the fastest growing sectors of the world economy. It's still one of the largest sector, although we had, of course, a huge decline in the corona pandemic. But if you look at the number, it's really tremendous. It's increased from 25 million in 2015 to 1.5 billion in 2019. And we should not forget, if we look at these global numbers, these global average numbers, that there's a huge inequality in there, because far not all the people that live in the world are able to travel and to overstep borders, territorial borders. So we are again talking here about consumption and lifestyle modes of only some people, mainly living in the global north. And why do I have these numbers for you? To remind you that we are really into an unsustainable present, and that all the socioeconomic trends, and I could display here a lot more, are showing in the same direction. And the direction is still the great acceleration. We are crossing tipping points, meaning planetary tipping points of the Earth system and social tipping points of welfare and well-being. We are living in multiple crises. We know that, and we keep repeating it. But in a way, we are also talking about ways out of the crisis. But I think we didn't really made any huge and fundamental progress so far. And what I'd like to ask, therefore, is sustainability then inscribed in the basic structures of modern statehood? So should we engage more profoundly, perhaps, with what we talk about when we mean the state and spatial planning procedures, for example, that is a governance mechanism coordinated by the state? So perhaps we can engage with that question while looking at the history of the governance of the sustainability concept and the discourses around that concept. And we could, as it's usually done, start by Hans Karl von Karlowitz, but I'd like to rather emphasize here that usually he is like named as the godfather of sustainability, but to some extent I would disagree, because he only looked at economic sustainability of the forestry system. So what he never talked about, for example, was talking about and taking into account the social dimension, the political dimensions, the inequality dimensions, or the ecological integrity of the forest. He just looked at the economic benefit of a forest. And I think that's one major misunderstanding, while always referring back to him, because since then we established a much more profound understanding of sustainability. And many people contributed to that understanding, and these people, they came from science, like Rachel Carson with her famous book, The Silent Spring, of course, the Club of Rome with its limits to growth, but more recently, the Brundtland Commission, already published in 1987. More recently than perhaps, and more familiar to most of you by perhaps then engaging directly with, is the Anthropocene concept introduced by Paul Crutzen in 2002, that perhaps marked really another paradigm in thinking about human-environment relations. And then the Stern report, published in 2006, about the economic costs of climate change, and more recently in 2011 published the report on the world in transition, that really sparked a huge discussion about transformation, which then also the whole discourse was taken up by, for example, spatial sciences and geography. So this is one part of the story, the scientific and academic part, but that sparked a lot of reactions in the political arena. I only name a few here. We had this first international conference on human environment in Stockholm, where we first talked about sustainable development. Then later on, a lot of environmental protection agencies have been founded and created, also the one in Europe, but then also later on in Germany. We had many more international conferences. We had strategies on sustainable development on all levels and scales, on the international scale, but also on many national scales. We saw that in 1915, the United Nations, they published and agreed to the Agenda 2030 with the 17 sustainability goals. In 2019, the new European Green Deal for climate neutrality has been published, and so on and so on. What I want to show you here is that we have a long, long history in engaging with sustainability, science, and sustainability in policy. And we even have a lot of crises that complement this picture, and it's by far not all the crises that we could picture here. It's only a couple, it's only selected crises. The oil price crisis that fueled like the idea to shift towards renewable energy, for example, almost or more than 50 years ago now. We had the earthquake in Fukushima that supported the Ausstieg aus dem Ausstieg aus dem Ausstieg. You all know this discussion about the energy turnaround that was very politicized and that was very contested. We had, I don't have even the years written here, because we have almost every year heat waves and droughts with sinking groundwater levels, with farmers that don't know how to irrigate anymore their farmland, and they are not really used to irrigate the farmland because that has not been the case in many German regions. And of course, we had the Corona pandemic, which is both like a health crisis, but also, of course, as we know, a biodiversity crisis, because Corona just shows us that the relation between humanity and animals and the non-human world is somehow fundamentally distracted and disturbed. And starting in last year, we have the Russian war, which is another geopolitical war that we now face with all the consequences that we are discussing. What we could ask ourselves now is, can we learn from all these crises? Can we learn from the long history that we have with dealing with sustainability, both in science and policy? But can we also, more acute than, learn from the actual crisis? And do we actually learn? Well, let's briefly look into the whole debate of governance, very briefly, of course, because we do not have that much time. We had a shift from planning and the state-centered control and steering spatial development towards governance. We all know the discussion, also to recognize the relevance of interactions between multiple actors across scales and with multiple coordination spheres across scales. But also this discussion was sparked due to popular participation and the power relation it involves, and acknowledging the messiness of politics in practice, as Melissa Leach tells us. So that was a shift in a way in recognizing, okay, there's more about decision-making than just state-centered decision-making. Actually, there are more actors involved in these decision-making arenas. That is one argument here that we are all familiar with, I guess. But then, perhaps less familiar and less debated in the spatial sciences is that the idea of sustainability in itself is also highly contested. And there are different understandings and meanings of sustainability. And there are many mobilization of sustainability discourses that rather serve the interest of the status quo and that rather stabilize the status quo instead of really bringing change. So the idea of sustainability governance itself has a history and also politics involved. And one example from that is that sustainability is increasingly criticized for being a nirvana concept, a concept where you can put everything you wish under. You can create huge wish lists and you would know that it will never come true. But you can just put it there and store it there, and everyone could agree and give a signature. So this is what criticists say about sustainability because of this vagueness of the concept and because the contestedness is usually, under the surface. It's not really discussed. What do we mean when we talk about sustainability? But we can also remind ourselves that in the beginning of the Brundtland Commission and in the beginning when activists from peace movements, for example, from churches, from environmental social movements aligned forces to talk about sustainability, it was really about fundamental needs. It was about the question, how much is enough? What kind of resources do we need to live a good life? And it was fundamentally about justice. Justice concerns in terms of intragenerational justice, that is, for example, the North-South debate, but also more lately than intergenerational justice. So what about the resources that we consume today that are not there anymore for future generations? So these are the justice debates that are attached to the sustainability discourse. And my argument here would be we should keep that alive, that it is fundamentally about justice when we talk about sustainability. And I will show you why I think this is important in a minute. But let me say a few words about how we as spatial planners or as human geographers also tend to think about and deal with these conflicting ideas and tangents around social, economic, and ecological development. One huge paradigm is the integration principle. The integration principle is a very important principle when we talk about these different objectives and these different targets. And I think here is a danger in there as well, because thereby it is always possible to undermine, for example, ecological integrity or to just neglect inequalities a certain development is shaping and fostering. And I will come back to that later on. First, another argument here around governance debates that I want to make is that I think it is tremendously helpful to look also into other debates, into, for example, science and technology studies, but also into literature from political ecology, just to name a few. Anthropology would, for example, be another one, or political economy and resource economics that really deal with human-environment relations, but also how our underlying and guiding principles make it possible that we at all have something as cheap nature and more or less cheap labor. And one example how this is usually done and enabled by governance concept is, for example, the water, energy, food nexus concept, a governance concept that really gained momentum in the international debate It's sparked also by debates about water and energy scarcity. It's sparked by debates, how can we safeguard and secure these important resources when we also at the same time have to address the complexity and the complex relationships between these different dimensions, between, for example, water and energy. And this concept has, again, the same idea. It was meant to improve in a way the modes or the lifestyles and the security and the access to resources for the poorest of the poor, but it has turned into a governance concept that is rather enabled and governed by huge enterprises such as Nestle and other enterprises that are now using that concept in their interest. And therefore, I argue, it is so important to always look into the knowledge politics and not just use certain terms and notions, but to really zoom into how is a concept really used and employed, and how is it shaping the actual present. And the actual present, as I already said, is we are crossing critical Earth system processes. We are crossing already, now for decades now, human well-being thresholds and undermining and eroding the social foundation. We are in the midst of it, and it's happening, but it's happening most of the time elsewhere, not here where we live our very good life. And usually a reaction of science was, well, to understand the Anthropocene with its multiple crises, we need to understand better these complex dimensions, these complex factors, how they interrelate and how they then shape the unsustainable present. And this is certainly right in itself, but there's a danger in it. The danger is that if we assume that we would just need more of the current knowledge, it would not help us really, because this knowledge that we produced as Western societies, as Western modernities, is in alliance with our socio-economic world system. So our Western science, our separation of nature from the social domain, that is part of the problem. So we should not just add more science and more knowledge to the existing science, but we should ask fundamental questions, and we should use science as a way to intervene in the current imperial modes of living in order to change the Anthropocene. This is urgently needed, and critical scholars have been arguing for that for a while now, because they suggest to really engage with knowledge politics, and they ask, for example, does the nexus of knowing and governing stabilize the unsustainable pathway, thereby co-producing the multiple crises? And that is a question I'd like to elaborate with you now, to really ask, okay, in how far is our knowledge system co-producing the actual crisis that we live in? And first of all, I'd like to zoom into a very important underlying guiding principle of all our behavior, even of our practices as planner perhaps, which is the economic growth paradigm. I mean, you wouldn't find a single municipality that is able to withdraw from the idea to grow, right? And I think that is part of the problem already, because economic growth is enabling the consumption and production mode, which is at the same time driving economic growth, but it's also driving the material consumption on a global level. But this material consumption is only for the benefit of a few that are with me together here in this room, that live in the global north, that live rather wealthy lives. And we are able to do so because we rely on bordering processes, very important and very powerful bordering processes, in the way that we externalize our resources, our burdens, and that we draw resources from elsewhere. There has been just published a very interesting study that is showing that the unequal exchange driven by EU consumption is mainly drawing on resources coming from Eastern Europe or Eastern countries, east from our European countries. So, which is Russia, for example, which is Asia. So what I want to say here is our mode of living depends on resources that we get from elsewhere. We know this argument. Many have made that argument very clearly, but still we rely on it with all our strategies on the European Green New Deal, for example, with all our strategies for our energy turnaround. We rely still on this mode that can be also named and termed as a neo-colonial mode. But there are also ways out, at least in terms of thinking differently than growth-oriented. And one major move, of course, was, and it is still important, that we go to green growth-oriented sectors, but the efficiency paradigm is also not enough, I would argue here. If we really want to talk about and if we want to reach and live in sustainable and just futures, we need to transform our consumption and lifestyle patterns fundamentally. And we need to change cultural norms. We need to change everyday practices. And we need to change the foundational economy. And with foundational economy, I mean really the underlying infrastructures that enable our living in a way, that enable but also that shape how we consume resources. So it's really about a fundamental shift. It's away from technological fixes and the belief system that efficiency measures will do it and will solve the crisis. It's also away from too simplistic ideas of policy and institutional change, on too simplistic ideas of smart cities, because also any studies that have been conducted for now is that there is no indicator that digitalization will help us to save energy, for example. No, not at all. It might help us, but we also need to talk about sufficiency. And we need to talk about how much is enough to live a good life. And it is less than we have today, but it might be a better life than we have today. That might be the case. So we need to engage with that in order to really talk about a governance for sustainability. So what I don't want to do now is to talk about a governance of sustainability anymore, but how can we leverage the sustainability? And interestingly is that many of these efficiency practices are not fundamentally new in the sense of something never before thought of or practiced. Sufficiency, unlike consistency and efficiency, does not serve the promise of progress and modernity. And here we are. We are back into the idea of modernity that we believed in with our statehood as it was developed for our modes of living, but as it was also transformed and transferred, for example, to the colonies in the global south. Spatial planning has a huge history in here to play, like city planning mechanisms have been translated. I studied that a lot in Accra, in Ghana. It was mentioned that urbanization pathways also in the global south are one of my key interests. And there we studied, for example, how the British colony transferred powerful planning practices as part of the town and country planning, including its institutions, to the former Gold Coast, and how this created inequalities in the cities and across the city and the countryside in the first place, and how this, after now 70 years of decolonization, still persists and still shapes inequality practices. So we need also to look into our own practices, into our own knowledge and the corpus of knowledge, and be critical against that and get rid of some ideas, perhaps, in order to make the shift that is needed. And I mentioned already the foundational economy that is, in my eyes, so important to imagine an alternative future, as Simin Davoudi said, which is the ultimate goal in a way. And I think if we are able to change the way how we think about the economy as something that is inherently embedded in the social practices, an economy that also entails the unpaid care work, for example, and that integrates all this into our economic thinking, then perhaps we can make some progress towards sustainability. And a key element in that to play is infrastructure and the way we organize and the way we govern infrastructure. And if we organize the infrastructure in a way that it really serves everyone and it serves them in a foundational way, then perhaps we can make some progress towards sustainability and the transformation. But before we do so, we need to look into another dimension. I now deconstructed in a way the economic growth paradigm, but we also need to look in how we think about the state and statehood. And my argument here would be, and I got that from a recently published book as well, and it has been mentioned elsewhere already, that the conviction that the state could solve social problems, or we could also say socio-environmental problems, with the help of scientific knowledge was exhausted in theory as well as in political practice. We tend to believe in evidence-based policy and evidence-based planning. And of course, evidence is perhaps for us as academics, a very easy way to think about how evidence could go into policies, that it will inform policies, that it will be transferred into policies, but it's also too simplistic, and history has shown us that this has not been the case. Ariane Lehnert just published this book on Der erschöpfte Staat, the exhausted state, but other scholars like Thomas Risse and Ulla Lehmkuhl, for example, did that like 10, 15 years ago when they talked about limited statehood. And what they meant while talking about that is that we tend to believe in a strong state, that there is a strong state that is able to enforce legislations and to implement legislations and to steer development in the direction where we want to have it. But the history shows us that this has not been the case, at least not in the last 50 years with all these sustainability policies in place. So they therefore talk about limited statehood and limited statehood capacity, and that we need to transform the way we think about the state and in how far the state is really able to get to solutions. And that is also sometimes termed as solutionism. And solutionism, in a way, is over. To give you two examples of this limited statehood and how it could look like, it's really not meant that it's the limited or only the limited statehood in the global south, where we have, for example, these post-colonial spaces where we have a vacuum of political power. Rather, we also find that limited statehood here. We find it, for example, or we found it right after the flood disaster in the Ahrtal Valley. I don't know if you followed what was happening there, but there was days after, but also immediately after the catastrophe, there was, in a way, no state that was steering the development there and guiding the development, helping people, supporting people. But what happened there was that, for example, people from right-wing parties went there and distributing fake news and creating really something that we can term limited statehood in these areas. And this has a legacy. I was just talking about with someone who's responsible for the recovery process there. And it's really hard to now, even years after the catastrophe, to build trust in state responsibility and to build trust in the potentialities for recovery. Another example, Cordula Kropp provided in a very interesting article where she said that we would even find this limited statehood in local climate governance communities, in pioneering communities, where the state is not really able, like the municipality in that case, the municipality is not able to implement measures towards the energy turnaround, but where pioneering actors are doing that. She said, well, we can interpret that also as a way of limited statehood in the context of climate governance. And I think if we really look for these areas and these dimensions of limited statehood, we would find a couple of them. And I think it is important to have that in mind while reflecting on the governance of sustainability and the governance for sustainability. And it is important because our knowledge is always performative, and also our knowledge and the way we perceive and think about the state is performative. But also our knowledge on the crisis that I have been mentioning throughout my talk is performative. And Löwbrand, together with others, published a very interesting paper on the questions whose knowledge counts for the future in the Anthropocene. And they said that in the quest for solutions to urgent collective action problems, the focus has primarily been on means rather than ends, and attention has hereby been diverted away from the social and cultural norms, practices, and power relations that drive environmental problems in the first place. And that was exactly my argument. So it's the governance that is important, but in a double meaning and in a double sense. So the current governance practices are stabilizing and thereby reproducing the crisis. So therefore we need to transform the governance and the way scientific knowledge underpins the governance systems. And that is the important thing. And thereby we also are always required and reminded to rethink how we conceptualize these different or seemingly different spheres between science and policy. We all agree, I guess, that we cannot think about it as two different and two separate domains. That has long been deconstructed, that idea that speaking truth to power is no longer valid. It has never been valid, but there are much more profound ways to conceptualize that in co-creative, co-productive processes of knowledge generation. But still, I think we have a great deal to learn and to improve that hybrid spaces, to really create hybrid spaces where it is possible and where it's allowed to produce knowledge that is needed for this transformation. And this is, I think, a huge task that we have to do in a way. we as spatial scientists from whatever subdiscipline we are coming. And this will be my last slide. And in a way, it is a summary. So where do we stand now while reflecting on science and policy in the context of sustainability governance? Well, if we look at the analytical dimensions of governance, I would argue we really need and improve in challenging apolitical and ahistorical understandings of environmental change. Like the crisis is not just out there, it is produced. It has been produced by governance mechanisms. We need to acknowledge thereby the social production of nature, because nature and society, they do not exist independently of each other, but they are entangled and mutually constituted. So it's a co-evolutionary process. And part of that is also, if we really see that social natures exist as like one entity, that the economy is an integral part of that. And if we want to transform these societal relations to nature, we need to transform our understanding of the economy, and we need to transform our economic practices. And we can no longer separate nature from the social dimensions, and we cannot any longer create a cheap nature that it is for the sake of being exploited. And the same with people that work for our consumption modes in labor conditions that are really, disaster-like conditions. And that means for the knowledge production that we need to incorporate different volumes, norms, and knowledges. We need to acknowledge the plural ways of knowing, the diverse ways of knowing of the world, of economies, of nature, and also about the future. And I think here we also need to get better to include all these diverse voices, to really learn from these ideas and cultural practices, for example, and to learn from them, to learn also from them in order to see where the real agency is to bring about change, if it's not with a limited statehood capacity. And in terms of the normative dimensions of governance, I would argue that we should always remind ourselves that sustainability is about justice concerns, and it's about a fair and just distribution of resources. And political action can be revolutionary when it leads to fostering recursive, careful, and collective well-being that is simultaneously social and ecological, says Sultana Farhana, who is really an important voice. She is based in the United States, but she is a voice that speaks for post and decolonial practices in thinking about more just futures. And she constantly reminds us that it's about inequality, different dimensions of inequality, like socioeconomic, age, gender, race, ethnicity, all the inequalities you can think of, and that these inequalities play out in different justice dimensions, the procedural justice, the distributive, but also the recognitional justice, which really brings us to the underlying ontological and epistemological questions, because I think sustainability is about these fundamental questions. With this, I thank you for your attention, and I'm curious for your questions.